you're wearing a $2,000 tuxedo that was made at Elizabeth Courtney Costumes.
Welcome back to One Big Caper. I'm Phelyx. This is my partner Athena, and this is an unscripted show during which we share whatever comes to mind. It's actually viewer and listener driven, so we want to hear from you any old time at hello@onebigcaper.com. This particular episode is another installment in our Pivotal Moments series. This is just kind of a little sideshow to One Big Caper, I suppose, but still should have some juicy bits, our signature little extra something on our stories. These are stories about entertainers who are either trying to assimilate to suburban life or regular jobs, and by regular we mean steady paycheck mostly, I think. But my
Not
work
being
as
on stage.
not being on stage.
Yeah.
My work as an entertainer, the income is pretty much like this. I'm working to level that out a little bit. Nevertheless, as a pivotal moment, these are not just unscripted, but really not cued. We each come up for this particular series. We each come up with a moment in our own personal history that either changed things or kind of set the course for where we're going. And for that matter, I think a pivotal moment could be something that caused us to avoid something altogether. But my story is not such today. And I just came up with this. I haven't given it a whole lot of thought, so forgive me for that. We constantly talk with each other. We have these conversations. And one of the things that came up the other day was a quote I was remembering from Andy Warhol. And that quote was published in the Andy Warhol Diaries. This is a copy of that. If you don't know, I studied Andy Warhol for more than 10 years and have recently been working on writing my book about whatever it is I learned in my deep studies of Andy Warhol. So the quote, which I wasn't remembering exactly how it was worded, but there's an experience in my life that it always reminds me of. And so what Andy said, and I got it out to read so that I don't get it incorrect. And again, this was just part of something he said over the telephone that was all recorded by Pat Hackett, who published the diaries. But he said, "And your own life, while it's happening to you, never has any atmosphere until it's a memory." And I've given that some thought a time or two over the years. I certainly read it many years ago, but there's one place, and I wish it still existed. My grandmother, in her advanced age, when I was about, I want to say 7 years old, she was put in an assisted living facility. And that place was a time capsule from the 1930s. The smell of it, the look of it, I can imagine all of that. And maybe when I was a kid, I kind of recognized that it had an atmosphere about it. But in retrospect, man, that was really, it affected me. And it may have influenced my taste. I don't know. But I was very fond of this place, and it really was a time capsule from the 1930s. Everything about it, the furniture, the floor treatments, the ceiling, every element of it was just protected for, this would have been in the 70s, so protected for like 40 years probably. Yeah. So it wasn't that old. Now it would be considered ancient.
Yeah, but it's like people now who have decor from the 80s, with like floral wallpaper and stuff. And that's like back.
It's horrible. It's horrifying that anybody would have that.
Yeah, but that was 40 years ago.
That was 40 years ago? Yeah, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's unpleasant to think about. Anyway, so that's kind of pivotal. It certainly is a memory that has a whole lot of atmosphere now. I mean, cigarettes were still indoors, and so that was part of this ambience. It was populated by elderly people who probably didn't see it as all that foreign a landscape. It didn't to them probably look as much like a time capsule as it did to me.
Yeah.
So it's likely that that was very informative as to what my tastes were, at least for my character work and my set for my shows and that kind of thing. So I would say that that's kind of a pivotal memory. But the juicy bit to go along with that is probably more pivotal and informative and important in my history, and that is that at 7 years old, we were visiting my grandmother frequently. The facility was not far from where we lived, so it was easy for us to visit her with some frequency. And on one occasion, I brought along a gift that my father had given me and took it to the facility and entertained people for hours with this marionette. I was 7 years old, so this seems like the strings were longer at the time, but I was a smaller person. So I entertained people for hours with this silly little marionette, and I had an audience, and they loved it, and they asked me to bring it back when I was going to go back. So I was getting gifts and whatnot, so that tips, not money, but tips nonetheless, from other residents at the facility, because I would go entertain them with my silly marionette. So that was kind of my first gig.
Huh.
And I was 7.
7.
Yeah. That's my story.
Wow.
And I'll bet you have one.
So my pivotal moment, I had a couple in mind, and I was going to just see what you decided to talk about.
Okay.
And this one is just a favorite of mine, so I'm going to talk about costuming.
Okay.
So there's like 2 parts to this. It was like a graduation of appreciation for construction. And so when I was growing up, I started on stage when I was 3 years old in the little recital every May or June, and wearing our little costumes that we bought out of the costume catalogs. So every dance studio at the time, I don't know if it's still done this way, they're probably made, but the costumes were pre-designed, and they were like, okay, this is going to be for this number and this number. So my mom literally would go through the entire schedule and costume with the teachers of the other classes, what those kids were going to wear, and then everyone would have to buy their costume, $30 to $100 for each number. So it was always bought. I don't remember the names of the companies, but then when my dad started the costume shop, it was Ruby's. Mm-hmm. And Ruby's is still around. Mm-hmm. You can still buy Ruby's even on Amazon. And so we got our pick of those costumes. And it wasn't until I think I was on point. So I must have been 11 or 12 years old. And I got my first tutu. And it was actually made for me. Yeah. It had the full like bodice with the hooks, and it wasn't like the flat tutus. It was more like, the person they had make it, I don't even know who it was, but it wasn't like the best, but it was made for me. I got measured, and then that started off this whole period where other people were making costumes for us. And then they would set the rhinestones with the little prongs and all of that stuff. And so that moved into when I was about 14, I was in the Nutcracker, and this company bought a bunch of costumes from the San Diego Ballet, or California Ballet is what it was called, in San Diego. And they bought the whole set of Nutcracker costumes, and the ballet mistress, who was also the principal dancer, she started making the costumes better, kind of like they do in burlesque. They buy something that's already made, and then they embellish it. They embellish the crap out of it, make it look better. So that's kind of what she did. And it wasn't until I was 14 years old. This is really funny. I was in love with this Russian, he actually was Ukrainian dancer, that they brought in to be the prince, the Nutcracker. And they brought him in, and one day, like, they had to do a repair on his tunic thing, and they let me do it. They let me sew, and I took like the greatest care sewing the stitches exactly like 1 millimeter apart all the way down the back, like, because she had altered it to him, and she was like, I don't have time for this, so she had me do it. But that kind of was like a pivotal moment for me, because I realized that I could make things too. Like, I was already making stuff. Like, I made my first, this is a juicy bit, I made my first craft accessory project. I made my own slippers, and I made them out of terry cloth and paper towels. They were literally just had the band across, and I traced my foot, and I just figured it out. And this was way before the internet. So like, I think I glued them or so. I don't even remember. My mom probably still has them. But that was like a major pivotal moment for me, because all of a sudden costumes were not just pictures in a catalog that you order and then they look okay. They were actually custom made for you. So fast forward to when I get into Jubilee, and I'm in this show where all of the costumes are designed by Pete Menefee and Bob Mackie, and they're like $10,000 to $30,000 costumes each. Mm-hmm. You're wearing a $2,000 tuxedo that was made at Elizabeth Courtney Costumes, and it's custom fit to you. Mm-hmm. And that like changed how I shop now, like what I keep in my closet when I thrift. It changed everything. So that was like, that's the two parts. Like, one, that I had this appreciation for things being made for you. So everything was bespoke costumes. But then later on, these were designer costumes, major designer costumes. And then that pretty much set the tone for my my whole wardrobe. And I'm really picky about what I put on my body anymore. So that's a pivotal moment. It was when we went from costume catalog costumes to made for us. And costumes back then were very different than they are now. Lyrical dresses and such started then, but everything was spandex and Georgette skirts pretty much at that time. It was early or late 80s, early 90s. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the
when it comes to costuming or wardrobe for work or whatever, fit is everything. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Fit is everything.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that was one of the things, is that everyone had their own costume. If you were an understudy and you had to go into the principal spot, it sucked because that costume didn't fit you. It was fit to that person. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then like the swings, I heard a certain swing couldn't wear, one of the ladies that I interviewed, she couldn't wear her costume because that girl was like a twig and the other one was more curvy, bigger woman. So she they ended up making the swings their own color costumes. So yeah, that's a little Jubilee trivia. But trivia. Yeah. I mean, that was one of the lovely things about Pete Menefee, is that he made sure all the swings had their own costumes because he had a bad experience as a performer.
Yeah, he as a dancer, it changed the rules for him. So as a performer, Pete Menefee became the designer, but he became the most valuable designer because he knew what it was like to have to perform in these costumes and how restrictive some costumes could be, and he fixed all that. Brilliant.
Like, he has amazing stories, and you can hear some of them on the Showgirls Life podcast.
Yeah.
And he's on podcasts all over about.
We'll get you another link to one of Athena's interview episodes with Pete Menefee. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, we thank you. Get a hold of us any old time. We will love to continue to do this. We'll be back around for another pivotal moment, but we're going to dig into some juicier episodes.
Yeah.
Thank you.